Red and blue lights pulsed on the horizon, reflecting off the walls of the old house. Marianne stood frozen beside Mark, the family lawyer and an old friend, as the police moved toward the farm. The sound of sirens pierced the heavy silence of that autumn night. Her heart raced, her feet rooted to the ground as if the land she loved so much could still protect her from everything that was happening. But it couldn't. Not anymore. Ethan walked out of the house, his face cold, unreadable, but his eyes betrayed a mix of shock and panic. "What's going on here?" His voice sounded different, as if he were grasping at the control, slipping through his fingers. "It's too late, Ethan." The words left her mouth weaker than she had hoped. The son who had once run through these fields, the one she believed would carry on the family legacy, now stood before her, facing the law, facing the consequences of his betrayal. She had never thought this moment would come, not like this. As the authorities approached, Ethan tried to argue, but the officers ignored him. "You can't do this, Mom. This isn't fair," he shouted, his anger rising. Marianne felt the tears well up in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. It was too late to turn back now. As they led him away, Marianne's mind drifted into the past. How did we get here? Everything she and Thomas had built. All of it. How had it all started? The afternoon sun bathed the vast fields of Carter Farm in golden light, a testament to a lifetime of hard work. Marianne, now 68, walked through the garden she and her late husband, Thomas, had nurtured over the decades. The earth beneath her feet still brought comfort, a connection to memories of better times. Here, everything felt as it should be. The farm symbolized all that was good and just in Marianne's life. Ethan, her only son, didn't share that sentiment. At 30, he had become more distant, absorbed in a world that seemed to have no place for the land that had sustained their family for generations. Marianne noticed it, but did her best to ignore it. He had always been a good boy, even if he had never shown much interest in the hard work of farming. That afternoon, while watering the flowers, her memories carried her back to when Ethan was just a boy. He would run through the fields, playing with the animals, carefree and unaware of the future. Those were simpler times. Thomas was alive, and though life on the farm was tough, it was filled with love and hope. But since Thomas had passed, everything seemed to be unraveling. Marianne clung to those memories, the past she held so dearly. But now there was a growing distance between her and Ethan, a disconnection she couldn't understand. He barely spent time at home anymore, always rushing off, always eager to be anywhere but there. That night at dinner, the air was thick with tension. Ethan chewed in silence, his eyes staring off into some distant place. Marianne, on the other hand, longed to make conversation, to feel some warmth in the exchange of words, but everything felt cold and distant. "Have you ever thought about selling the farm?" Ethan's words broke the silence abruptly. Marianne's fork slipped from her hand. "Sell?" she repeated, disbelief in her voice. What was Ethan suggesting? The farm was everything to her, the center of her life, the symbol of the legacy she and Thomas had built with so much effort. "Yes," he continued, indifferent to the weight of his words. "These big agricultural companies, they pay a lot of money. We could sell and still have enough left to live comfortably." Marianne blinked, trying to process what he was saying. "Sell it to who? Why would we do that?" Her voice trembled, as if the mere idea of it could crack the ground beneath her feet. The farm wasn't just land, it was the heart of their family, an extension of her own life. Ethan didn't seem to notice the pain in her voice. "Mom, the farm is outdated. This old way of living doesn't have a place in today's world. I don't want to spend the rest of my life here." Those words hit Marianne like a punch to the gut. Ethan's rejection wasn't just about the farm. He was rejecting everything she and Thomas had fought to build. Marianne fell silent, unable to continue the conversation. She had never imagined that her own son could see this place as something disposable. That night, after Ethan had gone, Marianne sat alone with her thoughts. The family photos hanging on the walls, seemed to be the only thing preserving the memory of happier times. She looked at the empty chair where Thomas used to sit, wishing more than ever that he were still there. Maybe he would know what to do. Maybe, with him by her side, Ethan wouldn't have drifted so far away. But reality was different, and a growing sense that something was terribly wrong gnawed at her. What else could Ethan be hiding? The threat of losing the farm now lingered in the air, but Marianne still believed there was a chance to stop it. She just didn't know how quickly everything would come crashing down. The days that followed that tense dinner became a reflection of the uneasy silence between mother and son. After hearing Ethan's proposal, Marianne tried to continue her daily routines, but something inside her had changed. It was as if the house, the land, and even the air she breathed had lost part of their essence. Meanwhile, Ethan seemed increasingly impatient, distant. That morning, he appeared at the breakfast table with tired eyes and a resolute attitude. Marianne served him coffee, searching for a trace of familiarity in his face, something that reminded her of the boy she once knew. But all she saw was a man determined to escape from that place. "Mom, we need to talk about the farm again," Ethan began without preamble. "I can't live here anymore. I feel trapped." Marianne gripped the cup in her hands, though the shock of his words echoed in her mind. She wasn't ready to hear this again. "Trapped?" she repeated, her voice filled with disbelief. "You grew up here, Ethan. This land is part of us. It's not a prison." Ethan sighed, visibly frustrated. "You don't get it. I want a different life, a modern one, with opportunities. The farm, it doesn't give me any of that. We're stuck here." His words cut her like a sharp blade. He couldn't see what she saw, the deep roots, the connection to the land, the lifetime of hard work. To Marianne, the farm was their family's legacy, a place of history and love. But to Ethan, it was an anchor that kept him tied to a past he no longer wanted to be part of. "And what do you want me to do?" she asked, trying to hide the pain in her voice. "Abandon everything we've built? Everything your father fought to keep?" Ethan looked away, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "I'm not asking you to abandon anything. I'm just saying that if we sell, we'd have a chance to live better. You too. It's not just about me." But Marianne knew it was. Ethan's desire to escape was a cry for freedom from something he saw as outdated. She couldn't understand how the son she had raised with so much love and effort could want to walk away from it all so easily. The tension between them grew with every conversation. Ethan spent more and more time away from the house. He left without saying where he was going and returned late, his expression increasingly closed off, almost indifferent. Marianne felt like she was losing him, but she didn't know how to bring him back. She clung to memories of Ethan running through the fields, laughing alongside Thomas. But those images now felt like smoke, dissipating with every new argument. One afternoon, while tidying up the living room, Marianne noticed something different. Old photos she had always kept on a shelf were missing. They were pictures of Thomas, of a young Ethan playing on the farm. They had always been there, and now they were gone. Her heart tightened, and without needing an explanation, she knew it had been Ethan who removed them. That night, she confronted him. "Did you take the photos from the house?" He stood in the doorway, ready to leave once again. "Yeah," he replied flatly. "I don't need reminders tying me to this place." Marianne felt like a stranger in her own home. The place that had once overflowed with memories of happiness now felt empty, stripped of its history. She looked at Ethan, trying to find some spark of understanding in his eyes, but he seemed further away than ever, more determined to leave it all behind. That growing emotional distance suffocated her. Every attempt to connect felt in vain, and she wondered how much longer she could bear the presence of a son who no longer seemed like the boy she once knew. And so, the distance between them solidified, like an invisible barrier that grew wider with each passing day. Marianne clung to what remained of the farm, of the memories, and of Thomas's legacy, while Ethan moved closer to a life far from there, never looking back. But deep down, Marianne knew the worst was yet to come. She could feel it in the air, like a storm approaching quietly but with devastating force. The atmosphere on the farm grew heavier each day, as though the walls and fields themselves sensed that something terrible was looming. Marianne didn't want to admit it, but there was a feeling of imminent loss hanging over her. Ethan, on the other hand, seemed more determined than ever. He was no longer the son she once knew. Now his actions were calculated, his gestures cold, as if he were orchestrating something in the shadows. It was on an otherwise ordinary morning that Ethan set his trap. He approached Marianne while she was tending to the flowers in the garden, his voice unnaturally calm. "Mom," he began, holding some papers in his hands. "I've been thinking, maybe we could make a few improvements to the farm. Nothing big, just enough to modernize it and increase productivity. You know, make everything more efficient." Marianne looked at him, suspicious. In recent months, anything Ethan said about the farm seemed to be laced with ulterior motives. "Improvements?" she asked, standing up slowly. "What exactly are you talking about, Ethan?" "It's simple," he said, flashing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "A few changes to the contracts and farm management. Just some signatures to formalize things. You don't need to worry about the details." Marianne hesitated. There was something about this that didn't feel right, but the idea that Ethan might actually be trying to save the farm, rather than sell it off, gave her a small glimmer of hope. She took the papers with trembling hands and leafed through them, but the legal clauses and terms were too complicated for her to fully understand. "Are you sure this is necessary?" she asked, searching for hidden truths in her son's expression. "Absolutely," he replied, his voice brimming with confidence almost to an irritating degree. "This will help all of us. Trust me." Marianne looked at the papers for another moment before taking the pen. Part of her heart screamed at her to stop, but the other part, the part that still saw Ethan as her boy, believed that he would never do anything to harm her. "You're doing this for the good of the farm, right?" Ethan just nodded, his expression unreadable. She signed. In that instant, a slight chill ran down her spine, but she pushed the feeling aside, convincing herself she was doing the right thing. After all, Ethan was her son. He wouldn't betray her. The days that followed were strange. Ethan was more present, but his attitude toward the farm had changed entirely. He no longer spoke about improvements or modernization. Instead, he began treating the farm with a coldness that frightened Marianne. She noticed small changes, sentimental items disappearing, details altered without her consultation. The barn where Thomas had stored his old tools was emptied without warning, and Ethan began moving in heavy machinery, claiming he was making adjustments. Each little change was a blow to Marianne's heart. The farm, her home, was beginning to feel like a foreign place, and Ethan himself was becoming unrecognizable. However, it wasn't until a few weeks later that the full truth came crashing down on her. Marianne was at home when Mark Peterson, an old family friend and retired lawyer, paid her an unexpected visit. He seemed troubled, his expression hard to read. "Marianne," he said gravely, "I'm concerned about those papers you signed. I took a look at them and they're not contracts for improving the farm." She felt the ground drop out from under her. "What do you mean?" Mark sighed and looked at her with sorrow. "You signed the entire farm over to Ethan, Marianne. He's now the sole owner. Legally, you have nothing left." The shock hit her like a wave of ice. Mark's words echoed in her mind, but they didn't make sense. "No, that can't be," she stammered. "He told me they were just improvements." Mark placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "I'm sorry, Marianne. He used your trust against you." She could barely breathe. How could Ethan do this? Everything she and Thomas had built, the family legacy, was now in the hands of someone who saw the farm as nothing more than a business transaction. She tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Part of her didn't want to believe it, but another part knew, deep down, from the moment she signed those papers, that something had been wrong. In the days that followed, the betrayal manifested in concrete actions. Ethan began removing objects that were part of the farm's history, as if he were erasing the past to make way for the future he had always wanted. Marianne watched as he dismantled the swing that Thomas had built for Ethan when he was a child, without even bothering to ask if it mattered to her. The symbol of betrayal was everywhere. Ethan hadn't just taken the farm, he was erasing its history, piece by piece. Now feeling powerless, Marianne found herself a stranger in her own home. And the worst part was, she didn't know how to stop him from destroying what little was left. The silence on the farm seemed even deeper in the days following Mark's revelation. Marianne lived as if in a dream, no, a nightmare, from which she couldn't wake. Every step through the house, every time her eyes crossed the vast fields outside, brought a sharper, deeper pain. The farm, which once was her safe haven, now felt like a prison made of her son's lies and manipulation. Mark remained close, trying to guide her through the next steps, but his words often blurred in her mind. Had she really lost everything? The very question seemed unrecognizable. Reality was a shock she couldn't process. One afternoon, as Marianne sat at the kitchen table reviewing the documents with Mark once again, the truth hit her with full force. Staring at the papers confirming the complete transfer of the farm to Ethan, she felt a knot tighten in her stomach. Each word on the page was a brutal confirmation of her son's betrayal. "I can't believe he would do this to me," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the paper in front of her. He's my son." Mark looked at her, his expression soft but serious. "I know it's hard, Marianne, but the truth is he did. He knew exactly what he was doing. He planned everything. He planned." Mark's words echoed what she had feared to admit to herself. The Ethan she knew, the boy who used to run through the fields, was as distant as the days when Thomas was alive. Now she faced a calculated man, a stranger inhabiting her son's body. Marianne realized she could no longer deny the reality before her. The farm, the land she and Thomas had built with so much love, now belonged to Ethan. And the worst part was that he had no intention of keeping it. When she finally summoned the courage to confront him, Ethan's cold behavior was an even more painful blow than the betrayal itself. She found him standing on the porch, staring out at the fields as if they no longer held any value for him. With a trembling voice, she asked directly, "Why, Ethan, how could you do this to me?" He took a moment to respond, as if carefully choosing his words, but his tone was emotionless when he finally spoke. "Mom, I did what had to be done. The farm, it doesn't serve us anymore. We can do so much more with the money from the sale. I'm going to sell it, and we can both move on." Marianne felt an icy chill run down her spine. The certainty in his voice, the calm and calculated tone, as if he were discussing a simple business transaction and not the fate of her life, her legacy. "Sell it? Ethan, this is our home. It's where your father, how could you even think of that?" But Ethan remained unfazed. "The farm is mine now, Mom. Legally, there's nothing you can do. You signed the papers. I'm just doing what's best for all of us." The pain in Marianne's chest was unbearable. It felt like all the air had been sucked from her lungs. "Best for who?" she managed to ask, her voice hoarse. "Because this isn't best for me. This isn't what your father would have wanted." Ethan stared at her for a long moment, and then, for the first time, his confident facade seemed to falter for a brief second. But he quickly composed himself. "The world's changed, Mom. We can't stay stuck in the past. I did what needed to be done." Marianne stepped back, tears streaming silently down her face. She didn't know what hurt more, the betrayal itself or Ethan's cold indifference, treating the fate of the farm and the family's legacy as mere obstacles in his path. In the days that followed, the reality of the situation became even more apparent. Ethan began taking active steps to sell the farm. He brought in real estate agents, discussed potential buyers, and even started clearing out parts of the house. For Marianne, every one of his actions was like ripping away a piece of her life. The farm, once a place of comfort and memory, had now become a battlefield, where every corner carried the weight of betrayal. Marianne knew she was being pushed out, not just physically, but emotionally. Ethan, with his meticulously laid plans, was forcing her out of everything she had ever known and loved. She spent sleepless nights wandering through the house, lost in thought, trying to find a way out of this nightmare. But every answer that came to her mind was crueler than the question. Had she really lost everything? Until one night in the depths of despair, the pain of losing the farm mixed with the pain of losing Ethan. She felt as though she no longer had the strength to fight. The son she had loved had become someone she no longer recognized, and the only thing left to do was accept that her life as she knew it was over. But then, a glimmer of hope. Sitting alone, surrounded by the memories that still lingered in the house, she thought of Thomas. She remembered his strength, his resilience in the face of the many challenges they had faced together. And it was then that Marianne realized she couldn't give up. Not yet. Not without a fight. With a newfound determination rising from the depths of her despair, Marianne called Mark. It was time to seek help. If there was any way to save what remained of her life, she would find it. And if Ethan wanted to sell the farm, she would do everything in her power to stop him. Marianne left the farm for the last time on a quiet morning, when the sun had barely risen over the horizon. The decision to leave wasn't hers. Ethan, with the same calculated coldness that had destroyed her emotionally, made it clear that there was no longer a place for her there. Legally, she no longer had rights to the land, and now it seemed she didn't have a right to her own home either. As she walked down the gravel road that led to town, she felt the weight of each step as if she were walking through a field of crushed memories. The sound of gravel under her feet was the only noise in the air, but the silence inside her was deafening. She had left everything behind: the house, the fields, and even the happy memories that now seemed to haunt her. Arriving in town, Marianne wandered the streets with the same uncertainty of someone who had lost the direction of her own life. She didn't know where to go, and worse, she didn't know where to start. People she passed greeted her with sympathetic glances, but no one offered more than that. Every face seemed to reflect her own shame, as if they were silent witnesses to her downfall. She tried seeking refuge with family, but quickly found that no one was in a position to help her. Her older brother, John, had moved to a distant city and lived a modest life, with no room to take in another guest. Her cousins, who lived nearby, had their own troubles, and though they welcomed her for a few nights, Marianne felt she wasn't truly wanted for long. She had become an unwanted visitor, even in the lives of her own family. Ethan's words echoed in her mind with every step she took. The farm is mine now. The thought of how he had destroyed everything she and Thomas had built was a burden she didn't know how to carry. How could her own son treat her with such indifference? The feeling of betrayal ran so deep that it felt as though every cell in her body was saturated with it. Marianne wondered how things had come to this point, and if at some point she had failed Ethan in a way she couldn't see. She remembered when he was a child, when his laughter filled the halls of the house and the farm was his playground. How had it all turned into a silent war over land? How had love transformed into a cold transaction? That night, alone in a cheap motel room, Marianne finally succumbed to despair. The tears came first like a light breeze, and soon became a storm of sobs that shook her entire body. The pillow muffled her cries, but nothing could silence the pain that consumed her. She was alone. What would Thomas think if he were there? What would he say to help her face this moment? No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't imagine an answer. He wasn't there to guide her anymore. The town felt strange to Marianne now. Separated from the farm, she saw herself as a stranger in her own world. The streets that once brought comfort now represented a reality she didn't know. The emptiness of loss was immense, and the humiliation of being betrayed by her own son was a burden she would carry forever. The next morning, after a near sleepless night, Marianne found herself on the verge of collapse. But in the midst of her pain, something inside her began to shift. She knew she couldn't spend the rest of her life running or grieving. Thomas would never have allowed that. He was a man of action, and even with a broken heart, she knew she couldn't give up without a fight. Determined, she went to see Mark Peterson. The old family friend and retired lawyer welcomed her with a concerned but firm expression. Mark was a man of principle, and when Marianne told him everything that had happened, he promised to help her seek justice. As they reviewed the documents once again, Mark noticed something that could change the course of this tragic story. "Ethan committed fraud, Marianne," he said in a serious tone. "He manipulated you, tricked you into signing the papers without knowing the truth. That's illegal." Marianne felt a spark of hope ignite in her chest. She knew that fighting Ethan would be painful and that the process would be long and difficult. But for the first time since she had lost everything, she felt there was something worth fighting for. She wasn't seeking revenge, only the chance to reclaim what was rightfully hers. The farm was her life, and she wouldn't allow it to be taken from her so cruelly. With Mark's support, Marianne decided to press forward. They began the legal process to challenge the fraud, and soon the police were involved due to the severity of the crime. Although the legal battle was exhausting, Marianne, for the first time in months, felt that she had something to live for. Ethan couldn't simply destroy her legacy and walk away without consequences. She knew the path ahead would be difficult, and that the son she had once loved no longer existed. But now, with Mark's help and the strength she knew Thomas would have admired, she was willing to fight to the very end. The weeks following Marianne's decision to fight for the farm brought a mix of anguish and renewed determination. The initial shock of losing everything slowly gave way to a strength she hadn't known she possessed. Mark Peterson, her friend and now her lawyer, was crucial in helping her maintain focus. Even so, the road ahead looked dauntingly long. Mark was tireless, diving into the documents Ethan had manipulated. His sharp eye for detail revealed several inconsistencies that would strengthen Marianne's case. "Here," he said one day, pointing to an obscure clause in one of the contracts she had signed. "Ethan clearly took advantage of your trust. He twisted the terms in a way that made it nearly impossible for you to understand what was happening. This isn't just immoral, it's illegal." Marianne, seated at Mark's kitchen table, absorbed each word with a mix of pain and hope. She had trusted Ethan, never imagining he could betray her so deeply. Yet, as she listened to Mark lay out the evidence of fraud, she realized that justice was still within reach. Ethan had crossed a line that could not be easily undone. As Mark prepared the legal documents to challenge the ownership of the farm, Marianne was forced to mentally revisit every moment Ethan had deceived her. Each memory was a painful reminder of how things had unraveled. She recalled his cold stare when he announced that the farm would be sold, the indifference in his voice when he told her that the house she had lovingly built no longer belonged to her. "It's going to be a tough battle," Mark warned, his eyes serious. "But the law is on our side. We'll show the court that you were manipulated and that Ethan didn't act in good faith. He broke a trust that should have been sacred." Marianne nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "I don't want him to suffer, Mark," she said quietly. "But I can't just let him destroy everything we built. The farm, it's all I have left." Mark took her hand firmly, a gesture that conveyed not only support, but a deep understanding of her situation. "You're not seeking revenge, Marianne. You're seeking justice. There's a difference." The tension was palpable in the days leading up to the lawsuit. Marianne knew that facing Ethan in court would be one of the hardest moments of her life. She didn't want to see her own son as an adversary, but he had forced her into this situation. Every step toward legal action carried with it an emotional weight that was almost unbearable. But she couldn't turn back now. Soon the lawsuit was filed, and the police became involved due to the fraudulent nature of the contracts. Ethan was called to answer for the accusations, and his response was nothing but contempt. "You're really taking me to court, Mom?" he asked, with a cold tone that pierced Marianne's heart. "This is pointless. Everything I did was for our benefit. You should just accept it and move on." But Marianne no longer saw the son she had raised. Standing before her was a man driven by greed and ambition. And as painful as it was, she knew she had to keep fighting. The tension between them intensified as the case progressed. Ethan began surrounding himself with expensive lawyers, betting on his ability to escape the situation unscathed. He acted as if he still had the upper hand, as though the control of the situation was firmly in his grasp. But each time he tried to intimidate or belittle Marianne, her resolve only grew stronger. One night, before one of the court hearings, Marianne returned to the motel room where she had been staying. Sitting on the bed, the quiet of the night was filled only with the echoes of memories of all she had lost. But instead of sadness, what filled her heart that night was a strange sense of calm. She knew the battle would be arduous, that every new stage in court would tear open the wounds between her and Ethan. Yet she also knew she was fighting for Thomas's memory, for the future they had dreamed of together, and for the love she still held for that piece of land. Marianne felt in some way that Thomas was there beside her, helping her gather the strength to keep going. The next day, Mark found new evidence to bolster their case. He had discovered that Ethan had not only manipulated the documents, but had also tried to sell the farm to a shell company to cover up his fraud. This gave Marianne's legal team a significant advantage. Now this wasn't just a family dispute, it had become a matter of financial crime. Things were starting to align in Marianne's favor. Each new detail that surfaced seemed to strengthen her case, bringing her closer to the justice she sought. Even so, she knew Ethan wouldn't give up easily. He was fighting for something he saw as his right, even though the way he had obtained it was completely corrupt. In the courthouse hallways, the tension grew. With Mark's help, Marianne was ready for whatever came next. Every move Ethan made was scrutinized, and each argument he presented seemed to lose strength against the clear evidence of his bad faith. Finally, the moment of reckoning was near. Ethan was about to face the consequences of his actions, and Marianne, despite the pain of the entire process, knew she was closer than ever to reclaiming what was rightfully hers. The final battleground was set, and all that was left was to confront the truth, no matter how bitter it would be. The day of the final confrontation arrived with an eerie silence hanging over the farm, now surrounded by police officers and lawyers. Marianne, accompanied by Mark and the authorities, felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her shoulders. It was as if all the memories that the place held were about to explode in one final act of justice. The distant wail of sirens announced Ethan's arrival. He stepped out of his car, irritation etched on his face, as if the entire scene was an unjustifiable inconvenience. He walked toward the house with determined steps, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of uncertainty. The presence of the police unsettled him. This was something he hadn't anticipated. Marianne watched in silence, her heart racing. She still struggled to believe that this man, so cold and distant, was the same boy she had raised. The same person who, in another life, had laughed in the fields and run with the animals. Now, the son she knew seemed buried under layers of greed and ambition. Ethan approached, hands in his pockets, staring directly at Marianne. "What's the police doing here?" he asked, trying to maintain composure, but his voice carried a sharp edge of anxiety. "This isn't necessary. I've already told you everything I did was legal." Mark stepped forward, his posture firm. "Actually, Ethan, it's not. We uncovered the manipulations you made in the documents, and that's fraud. The law is not on your side, and the authorities are well aware of your attempt to forge the sale of the farm." Ethan stood still for a moment, but the look of disbelief quickly turned into anger. "You can't be serious. Everything I did was for the good of the family, and now you want to ruin me?" Marianne, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward. Her voice came out soft but laden with emotion. "Ruin you, Ethan? You destroyed everything your father and I built. You took our home, our history, and tried to sell it like it was just a commodity. How could you do this to us? How could you do this to me?" Those words hit Ethan hard. He tried to maintain his defensive stance, but something inside him faltered. "I just wanted to make things better, Mom," he said, but his voice was weaker now. "I was trying to do what was best for both of us." Marianne shook her head, tears threatening to fall, though she held them back. "What you did wasn't for both of us. It was for you, for your ambition. You didn't think about what this would do to me, what it meant for our family. The farm was all we had." Ethan looked away, unable to face the pain his mother radiated. For the first time, the confident facade he had worn began to crumble. I just wanted to get out of here, he admitted, his voice breaking. I didn't want to be stuck in this place. I wanted something bigger, something better. Marianne stood in silence for a long moment, trying to process her son's words. She knew he had always felt disconnected from the farm, but she had never imagined that feeling would lead to such a deep betrayal. And you thought the only way to do that was to betray me? Ethan didn't respond. He just looked down at the ground, his hands trembling, as if he was finally realizing the enormity of what he had done. At that moment, the police officers stepped forward, ready to act. Ethan Carter, one of the officers said, "You're under investigation for fraud and document manipulation. We need you to come with us for questioning." Ethan lifted his head, his eyes filled with desperation. He looked at Marianne, searching for some form of forgiveness, some sign that she was still his mother and might protect him from the consequences. But what he found was a woman deeply hurt, devastated by the betrayal, yet standing with dignity and the strength of someone who had fought to reclaim what was rightfully hers. "I don't want revenge, Ethan," she said softly but firmly. "I just want justice." Ethan was led away by the police in silence. The shock on his face made it clear that he had never imagined things would go this far. He had always believed he could control the situation, that his mother would never stand up to him like this. But there she was, firm and resolute, fighting for what was hers by right. As he was taken away, Marianne felt a mix of emotions. The relief of seeing justice on the horizon was evident, but there was also a deep emptiness. Ethan was still her son, and no matter how much he had hurt her, she couldn't simply erase the love she had for him. It was a complex pain, a wound that might never fully heal. Mark placed a hand on Marianne's shoulder, a silent gesture of support. "He'll pay for his actions," Mark said. "But you've also won back what's yours. The farm is safe." Marianne nodded, but her heart was conflicted. The farm was hers again, yes, but at what cost? She had lost her son in the process, and the void it left was almost unbearable. As she gazed out at the farm in the distance, Marianne felt the wind blow softly, as if reminding her that despite everything, life went on. She had fought, and she had won. But now the real challenge was finding peace after all that had been lost. The trial took place in a stark courtroom, but the real burden Marianne carried was the emotional weight of the situation. She sat in silence, her hands clasped in her lap, waiting for the conclusion of a battle she had never wanted to fight. The room was filled with curious onlookers, but for Marianne, her focus was solely on one person, Ethan. He sat on the defendant's bench, his face stern, his posture rigid. Throughout the hearings, he had tried to maintain an air of superiority, as if he still believed he could escape the consequences of his actions. But as the evidence of fraud and legal manipulation piled up, Ethan's tone shifted. What once was arrogance had now turned into poorly concealed desperation. Both sides' lawyers argued relentlessly. Mark, with his usual determination, had handled Marianne's case with unyielding precision. Every detail of Ethan's betrayal was laid out clearly and meticulously, leaving no doubt that he had violated his mother's trust to fraudulently obtain the farm. Ethan had betrayed not just his family, but the law itself. When the judge finally began reading the verdict, the room fell into a heavy silence. The words echoed with solemn weight. Ethan was found guilty of fraud and document manipulation, and justice was on Marianne's side. The farm would be returned to her, and Ethan would face the legal consequences of his actions. The relief Marianne felt as she heard the sentence was immediate, but it was fleeting. The pain of knowing that her own son had sunk so low was almost unbearable. She had won the battle for the farm, but the war within her heart was far from over. After the trial, as everyone began to leave the courtroom, Ethan remained seated, unmoving. He didn't look at Marianne as the police escorted him away, his eyes fixed on the ground. There was a deep defeat in his posture, but also something more, a void that Marianne couldn't ignore. She had expected to feel some form of satisfaction from achieving justice, but instead, her heart was filled with a quiet sorrow. Later, when she returned to the farm, now officially hers once more, she found a letter from Ethan. The simple envelope lay on the kitchen table, and the handwriting inside was shaky across the lines of the page. It was a letter of apology. "Mom, I don't know if these words will mean anything to you after all I've done, but I need to say that I'm sorry. I don't know when I lost my way or how I let ambition consume me to this extent, but what I did to you, to our family, is inexcusable. I was blind. I thought I was pursuing something better for both of us, but deep down it was all for me. I believed the only way to free myself from the farm was to destroy it, and in the process I ended up destroying what was most precious between us: trust. I can't fix that now, but I hope somehow that one day you might be able to forgive me. I know it's too much to ask, but if there's any space for redemption, if there's ever a moment when you can look at me as your son again, I'll be waiting for that chance. With regret, Ethan." Marianne read the letter once, then again, and once more, each word weighing on her heart like a burden she didn't know how to carry. The request for forgiveness was sincere, but the damage had already been done. She still felt the sting of betrayal deeply, as if someone had pulled the ground from under her feet. And yet, the pain of a mother is not one that seeks revenge. It is a wound that longs for healing. She sat down on the living room couch, staring out the window at the fields of the farm she had reclaimed. Thomas's memories still filled the air, and in her heart, Marianne knew what he would have said. Thomas had always been a man of principles, but he was also a man with a generous heart. He believed in forgiveness, in the possibility of new beginnings, no matter how difficult they might be, but the path to forgiveness would be long. Marianne knew that while Ethan was remorseful, the emotional damage he caused wouldn't disappear overnight. The farm was safe, yes, but the bond they had shared was broken, and rebuilding it would take time. In the days that followed, Marianne found herself reflecting on the idea of forgiveness. She still felt the sting of betrayal, the humiliation of having been deceived by her own son. But she also began to realize that holding on to that bitterness would keep her trapped in a past she couldn't change. If she wanted peace, she would have to find a way to forgive Ethan, not for him, but for herself. She wasn't ready to offer him complete forgiveness yet, but the seed had been planted. Marianne knew the process of healing would take time. There was no rush. What mattered now was that she had reclaimed her farm, her history, and slowly, she was beginning to reclaim herself. The wind blew gently over the fields of the farm, swaying the leaves of the trees and creating a soft melody in the air. Marianne sat on the porch, gazing out at the horizon. For the first time in what felt like ages, the silence around her was comforting. The farm was once again in her hands, and although the pain of what had happened still haunted her, she could finally feel that peace was within reach. In the months following the trial, Marianne had returned to tending the land. What had once felt like an obligation now brought her a sense of purpose. Every flower that bloomed in the garden, every fruit harvested, was a reminder that she had preserved the legacy that meant so much to her family. The farm, which had nearly been taken from her, was thriving once again, just like she was. But there was a lingering emptiness. After the trial, Ethan had disappeared. There were no more letters, no more apologies. He was dealing with the consequences of his actions, and Marianne knew that the time he would need to find redemption, if that were even possible, would be long. Of course, she still thought about him. It was impossible not to. Even with all the pain, Ethan was still her son. But what had once been an open wound was beginning to heal. Marianne felt something had shifted inside her. The woman who had been betrayed, who had felt lost and rootless, had now found a new strength. The experience had transformed her, not just as a mother, but as a person. She was more resilient, stronger. On a typical autumn day, as the sun began to set, she walked over to the old swing Thomas had built for Ethan when he was just a boy. The swing had been restored and now swayed gently in the breeze. Marianne sat down on it, something she hadn't done since Ethan was small. and let herself drift through the memories. She thought of Thomas. She thought of how he would have faced all of this with the same calm strength he had always shown during their years together. He had always believed that the roots of their family were strong, and that even in the face of adversity, they would remain steady. Marianne felt that he would have been proud of her, proud that she had fought, that she had faced the betrayal head-on, and most of all, that she had not given up. Thoughts of Ethan followed closely behind. Marianne knew that forgiveness was a process, not an event. She wasn't yet ready to fully open her heart again, but she also knew that one day she would need to. A mother's love never dies, even in the face of the deepest hurt. There was room for forgiveness, even if it wasn't time yet. She sighed, letting the wind carry her thoughts away, and looked once more at the farm. The rich soil, the sturdy trees, and the vast sky seemed to embrace her, offering comfort. The farm was alive again, and with it, Marianne felt reborn. The weight of the betrayal was still there, but it grew lighter with each passing day. Time, she knew, would bring more clarity, more healing. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink, Marianne smiled to herself. She had found her peace. It wasn't the same peace as before, the quiet, uninterrupted peace, but rather a peace forged through pain, struggle, and redemption. It was a more complex, more complete peace that came from knowing she had overcome the hardships. The farm, the land that held so many stories, was safe in her hands. What the future would bring, she did not know. But for the first time in a long time, that didn't scare her. Life would continue its course, and she was ready for whatever came next. Marianne stood up from the swing, took one last look at the sky painted by the twilight, and walked back inside. The familiar smell of the old wood greeted her, and she felt a comforting warmth fill the space. The farm was hers once again, and finally, Marianne was at peace.